Hello, friends. What qualities are only attributed to God? I hope and pray that you'll stay tuned because today on The Logical Truth, that's exactly what we're going to be discussing. So just stay right there. Hello, friends, and welcome to The Logical Truth. My name is Wes Garland, and I am the pulpit minister here for the Central Church of Christ here in Saraland, Alabama. And I'm just so very delighted to have you join me today as we evaluate this study. Today we're asking, or actually not asking a question today, we're just doing a deep study of the attributes of God. Now, if you've never studied God, there are some qualities that are attributed only to God. And that's what makes him God. That's exactly what makes him deity. And it's very important for us to realize and to understand this one point, that if we're talking about God, we're only talking about the deity that is outside this realm of creation, because he himself is the creator. And a person cannot all of a sudden, something that is created cannot all of a sudden become God, because these attributes are not going to be able to be done if this individual is not already God. God is outside of creation. God is outside of anything created. Therefore, he's eternal, and we're going to get into that here in just a little bit. So as we start getting into these attributes, I think it's very important for us to realize there's only four main qualities that are only attributed to deity. And the very first one is that God is eternal. Now, what does that mean? We're talking about that God is really he does not have a beginning, he does not have an end, he has always been. And I know that in that type of mentality in our finite minds, it might be kind of hard for us to realize, because I know that in my discussions with individuals about God, they say, then where did God come from? Well, it's hard for our finite minds to remember this, because we are confined by time. We are defined by a beginning, and understand there's going to be an ending. We understand minutes and hours and days, and that's what we're all confined by. But God actually lives and reigns outside of those things. God has always been. There is not a particular point in time that God did not exist. Now, remember how Peter said it, that with God, 1,000 years is as one day, and one day 1,000 years. Now, understand what he's meaning by that. He's not saying that one day in eternity is considered 1,000 years, and 1,000 years in eternity is one day here on earth. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about how God actually is outside of time. He's always been, he is, and will always be. And so when we talk about eternity, it's important for us to remember that if anything had a beginning, understand this, my friends, then they cannot be God nor made into God. It's simply just this one particular point that we're talking about right here. Let's take a look at a couple of passages real quick. Remember there in Genesis chapter 1 and verse number 1, where God says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, it's a profound statement there to start off everything about creation, but understanding it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now understand, the beginning actually is like a timestamp that says that now, right here at this particular moment, something has started. Well, what is he talking about? He's talking about the creation of this world. Why did it take God 7 days to actually create all things in this world? Well, he didn't have to wait 7 days. Because remember, in each of the accounts, we even see right here where he says, let there be light, and there was light. As he spoke everything into existence, he could have easily said, let everything happen, boom, and all of a sudden everything happened. But he set those 7 days up for you and me, my friends. He was setting up our week. He was setting up time and the basis of time. So one point I really want to make with this verse right here is, if you look at the screen again, it says, in the beginning, God. Now, what does that actually mean? God was already before the beginning of this creation. He was before the creation itself. He lives outside of things that are actually created. Look at this. Look at Psalm 90 and verse number 2. He says, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, again, I mean, it's easier for our finite minds to think about, okay, living maybe forever, never having death, even though we are comprised of death all around us. But it's easier for our minds to say, okay, now something is now in existence and it can live on forever. But to have that type of mentality going forward to also now being applied going backward, kind of hard for us to fathom. But we understand by the scriptures, by what God's revelation tells us, he says he is from everlasting to everlasting. Now that simply means that he's always been in existence. Whenever he was talking with Job, my friends, you can see how at the very end of the book of Job, in chapter 38, he's starting to question Job about some things. And in a particular passage, you actually find that Job is being questioned going all the way back to the things of creation. Watch what he says right here, verses 4 through 6. God says this, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone?" Now, friends, he's asking him a load of questions right here to know, or to try to get him to understand who he is and where he came from. But in this discussion, he makes very, very clear that it was he himself who created all things. And if you go back to the screen, watch what he says. He says, "I laid the foundation of the earth." Well, in order to lay a foundation of the earth, you had to be in existence before the creation, right? He also says that in verse number 5, who determined its measurements? It was God himself that determined, okay, how big is this earth going to be? How big is this, all these universes that I'm creating right here, how big are they going to be? And then it says, even right here in in verse number 6, he says, to what were its foundations fastened? Who made the determination for all that? He did, proving his existence from eternity, that he's not confined to the realm of here and now. He's not confined about within the time frame of creation. Truly, my friends, it is the case. He is eternal. But another attribute that can be clearly seen is that he is also omnipresent. Now, what does this word omnipresent actually mean? Omnipresent actually means that he is everywhere at any time. Now, with that being the case, everywhere at any point in time, and also, I know you probably have heard this preached from the pulpits, how God is looking at a timeline of all creation from the beginning of time with Adam and Eve all the way through until the last person exists and Jesus comes in the day of judgment. He's seeing everything all within one grasp, and he can be at any particular point anytime he wants. Now, I know this may seem impossible, but understand this, my friend. Whenever we're talking about God being everywhere at any point in time, at any place, nothing is impossible with God. Nothing's impossible. And this is what we know this. Remember there in Matthew chapter 19, verse 26? He says, but Jesus looked at them and said to them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Now, I've got to ask this question, what does the word all actually mean? Well, that means anything and everything, right? And so God is not bound, and we're going to get to this here in a little bit later in our last point. But whenever you think about the power of God, God is all powerful. God is one who is not confined by the created things. He's not confined by rules and regulations in respect to what people want to put on him or what society wants to put on him. He lives outside of every bit of that. And therefore, what would be impossible, because whenever God created all things, he created things with laws so that everything can work together to be sustainable. But understand this, my friends, God lives outside of that. Now, I want you to notice this. Whenever you start looking at certain passages, such as Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24, watch what he says here. Can anyone hide himself in secret places? So I shall not see him, says the Lord. Do I not fill heaven and earth, says the Lord? Look right here at Proverbs 15, verse 3. He says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and on the good. Do we realize that God Himself, there is not a single place that man can go to hide from God? God knows exactly where everyone is at every particular moment. Now, this is going to be very beneficial, and we're going to get to that here in just a second, but He is literally saying that there's not a single place that the Lord will not know what we are doing or what we are involved in. Now, that means a lot, right? Now, with that being the case, I also want you to think about this from a logical standpoint. If it is the case, as what Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14 state, now watch what he says here. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. Now watch verse 14. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, this is not only an Old Testament concept, but it is also one of a New Testament. This is even brought up right here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse number 10. Whenever he says, therefore, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. Now, I want to ask you this simple, logical question. How is it even possible, if God is not everywhere at any particular moment, how can we be judged by everything that we have done in this body, even including what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, every secret thing? If God was not everywhere, my friend, it would be impossible. It really would be impossible, because if we could go to a place where God did not know, or if we could go to a place and where God was not, He would not then know what I was doing. But here's the thing, my friends, the Bible clearly states, and these are just two passages that define this, but there's multiple others that actually teach the same exact thing. God is going to judge us for everything that we have done in this life. Now, whether good or bad. Here's the thing. We got to look at this from a flip side account. Now, you think about this as a faithful Christian. It should actually give us extreme comfort to know that God is everywhere at any place where I am. Why? Because I want you to think about this. Since God is always near to us, that means that we are then never alone. Now take a look at this in Acts chapter 17, verse 27. Remember how he says there, so that they should seek the Lord. Now this is Paul preaching on Mars Hill. He says, in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him. Now watch this last phrase. Though He is not far from each one of us. See, my friends, the fact is that to a person who desires to have God close to them and want His protection and guidance, this should be a very, very encouraging and very comforting thing. But on the flip side of this, do we also realize that depending on who we are as a person, if we want God to actually be on our side, to be right there with us, or we don't, will determine how we view this point. Because it can be a very comforting, a very beautiful thing to know that God is so close to us when we're trying to live through our life. And we're never going to go throughout life alone, because He's always going to be right there. But take it on the flip side of this. If a person is not godly, a person who is not determined to do anything that God wants them to do, then think about this. Will the judgment day and knowing that God is actually all around us actually be a very scary thing? Well, absolutely. I think it's important for us to realize there in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, I know we just looked at verse number 10, but in verse number 11 it says, therefore, knowing the terror of God, we persuade men. There's not a single one of us that's going to be overlooked in judgment. There's not a single one of us that's all of a sudden going to be approaching judgment to a point that's saying that I'm not going to be held accountable for what I'm doing. My friends, here's the question I want to ask you though. Do you long to have God right there by your side? Do you long to have God to be there with you so you're never alone? To a faithful Christian who's trying to be faithful and knowing that I have struggles, that I have trials and tribulation that I'm going through, and maybe sometimes life just seems to be almost unbearable. To know that my God is right there with me, I'm never alone, that's a very comforting thing. It's all about the way you look at it. My friends, let's take a look at another point. Not only is God eternal and God is also omnipresent, but it also means that He's also omniscient. Now, omniscience of God and also the omnipresence of God sort of go hand in hand. Because He is everywhere at any particular moment and we can't hide from Him, the word omniscient simply means that He knows all things. Now, with that being the case, just like I said, that it can be a very comforting thing, and at the same time, it can also be that flip side type mentality of that if you're anti-God, if you're anti-godly, and you're trying to do things against God's will and everything, understand that God knows what you're doing, even in the secret places. There's not a single place that we can go to escape from God. But I want you to think about this from this point of view. Is God, if we are trying to be a faithful Christian, is it important for us to know that God knows what we're going through? That God knows the struggles we are having? He knows that we're right there having to deal with this type of situation? Absolutely, my friends. I'm glad that God is. And honestly, it's really important to realize this point as we're going through this, is that when God Himself, in His nature, the way that He is, and these attributes that are only attributing to Him, they're actually there for man's benefit, if you want to have it as a benefit. God knows what we're going through. He wants to help us. He wants us to acknowledge that He is there so that He can help guide us. Watch what He says right here in Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. Now, what does God want us to do? He wants us to recognize and acknowledge that He Himself is there. He knows exactly what you're going through. He knows what you're dealing with. He knows how you're feeling. He knows every single tear that comes down your eyes. He knows every fear that we have. Because of that, He says, just recognize I'm there. I'm there to help you. I want to help you. He says, trust in me. And if you trust in me and not lean on your own understanding, He says, listen, if you just acknowledge Him, He says, I will direct your paths. I'll tell you what you need to know. I will tell you which way you need to go, how to deal with this particular situation. And friends, we understand, according to Jeremiah 10, verse 23, that the way of man is not in himself, is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. We need guidance. And because of that, my friends, understand this. When we recognize that God is there, that He wants to help us, He loves us, and He's going to do what we need for Him to do to help us go in the right way, just like what Abraham asked God, will the one who is righteous do right? My friends, the only way that we're ever going to be right in the sight of God is to be guided by righteousness. And that's only found through His book. Now, I want you to notice this. There's a numerous amount of passages that I want to show you just real quick to prove this point that God is all-knowing in everything that He does. Now watch what happens here. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse number 13, he says, and there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. Watch 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20, and I particularly love this passage because in the context he's talking here about sometimes our hearts can condemn us, but it can bring about doubt of our salvation and things like that. He says, listen, for if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. If you ever have that inner doubt within yourself, guess what? It doesn't matter about our own doubt. God knows where we stand. God knows what we're doing. God knows if we're trying or if we're not. Are you not thankful for that? I know I am. What about Psalm 139, verse 4? He says, "For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." Even though I'm not able to speak these words, have you ever been in a state of where you are just so saddened by life and for some reason you just don't feel like you can ever really just talk? Well, guess what? God knows your heart. He knows exactly what you're trying to say. And for that, I'm very, very thankful. What about Matthew chapter 10, verse 30? Recognizing that, he says, "But the very hairs of your head are all numbered." Now, I know you can look at a few other people, and I know that some people have less hair than others, okay? I'm one of them. But here's the point. God knows exactly the amount of hairs that are on your head. That's pretty specific, right? Pretty specific. But it even goes even further than this. Watch this. Remember how whenever God was talking with Abraham and he says, "Look up into the stars. Can you count them?" And he says, "No, they're too numerous. I can't count them." Well, watch what Psalm 147 verse 4 says. He counts the number of the stars and he calls them all by name. God has recognition of all of the stars that are in existence that he created. And then on top of that, he even named them and he calls them by their name. I'm here to tell you, my friends, that's pretty knowledgeable, right? He doesn't need to have a telescope. He can see everything at all particular moments because he is there. And he knows everything very, very specific. Now, let's go on in the last couple of minutes into this last point. On top of God being eternal, upon top of God being omnipresent and knowing all things, omniscient, now we also see that God is also omnipotent. Now, what does that word omnipotent actually mean? Omnipotent simply means that he's all powerful, and all these things are for our benefit if we want to choose them as our benefit. Now, what does this mean? God is not limited to what this means that there is no limit to what God can do, and whatever he wants to do and perform, he will do it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's not restrained by the powers that are around him or whatever. He is independent. He does exactly what he wants to do. So if he gives a promise, can he always fulfill it? Oh, absolutely. Why? Because he is not confined to what man tries to make of it. I'm very thankful for that. And that's where we can literally put our trust within him. Now, I want you to notice a few passages as we start reading a few of these down here, because I really want you to see the power of God here. Remember there in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, I know we've already read this, but in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He is so powerful that he literally, in verse number 3 of the same text, he said everything into existence. He says, "Let there be light," and there was light. You even go to chapter 2, verse number 7, and we see that God formed man of the dust of the ground. He took that which was not even material in respects to man, did not have skin and bone and all that. He took the dust from the earth, formed that into man. Then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. How much more powerful can you get? Now, let's continue going further. What about verse number 22? He says, "Then the rib that he took out from Adam, that he'd taken from man, he said he made into a woman and he brought her into the man." So he took a rib out of Adam, and from that one bone, he formed an entire person. Now, not only just a regular person, but one that was made specifically for Adam. I'm here to tell you, my friends, that's pretty powerful. But you know what? One of the coolest things about the power of God, and it really showed, is whenever he rose Christ from the dead. I want you to think about this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, it says, "And God both raised up the Lord and will also raise us up by his power." Not only did he breathe everything into existence, Not only did he inspire individuals, because remember, like in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, that word in verse 16, um, inspiration is actually theos noutos, which actually means God breathed. And that's exactly what we are talking about right here. I want you to think about it from this perspective. The power of God can not only be read through this, but can also bleed into our lives and to make us what we ourselves could not make us. And that's the way that God actually chose to save mankind, was through the avenue of preaching. Now, as we've already seen, we see here that God himself is eternal in that he's always been. He's omnipresent. That means that he's everywhere at any particular moment. He's omniscient in that because he is everywhere at any particular moment, guess what, my friends? He knows all things that are going on. And he's all powerful. Now, this right here, this is really a blessing for us. That's why he says that if you listen to what I tell you and be obedient to what I tell you, you can become what I want you to become. And you think, well, have you ever heard individuals say, well, preacher, you just don't understand the things I've done in my life. I just don't think God can ever forgive me. Guess what? If God wants to forgive you, he will forgive you. Why? Because he is who he is. He's all powerful. He can perform anything that he wants to perform. That's why we can trust in his promises and trust that whenever he says that hereafter, you don't have to fear death. You don't have to fear judgment. Because remember how he says there in 1 John, he says that perfect love has actually cast out fear. And in the context, he's talking about fear of judgment. You can actually live your life in a place that is right there with God here physically on earth. But hereafter, you can be with him for all eternity, not having to fear judgment or anything of that nature. But because he's eternal, we can't put him away. Because he's omnipresent and omniscient, there's not a single thing that we can do that's outside of God's grasp. He knows all things. And then on top of that, he's all powerful. With his power can either become a blessing or a curse, depending on who we are. If we want to be godly, if we want to have God right there with us, to bless us in all of our life, we can do that. But also, my friend, you have to realize as well, we also have a choice that if we want God to be against us, understand this, if he's against us here, hereafter, he's also going to be against us. God's nature in and of himself, the attributes that only attribute to God, is actually for our benefit. But the question is, will you choose to use God as your benefit? It's your choice. He's not going to make you. My friends, I hope today's study has been one that has been very much a blessing to you, very insightful. But if I can help you in any way, please just reach out to me. But until next time, may God richly bless you. I love you. Have a great day.